High in a mountain meadow no living soul had walked in 25 winters. 6 covered wagons still stood in a careful open arc. Their canvas tops were gray, as driftwood, torn thin by a quarter-century of wind, but still stretched over the bows. Inside them nothing had been disturbed, a quilt folded square, as the day a mother's hands had laid it down. A tin coffee pot standing upright on a driver's seat. A pair of small leather shoes, with their laces tied in careful bows, waiting for feet that had grown or gone. At the meadow's edge, a woman in a coat too large for her drew her tired mare to a halt, and did not dismount. She was 36 years old, 3 months a widow, 200 miles from anyone who would speak her name without spitting. They had called her the Black Widow in the town below. Said her empty womb had drained the life from her husband. Said any woman fool enough to ride up a road that ate its own belonged to the mountain anyway. She swung down slowly, walked the silent circle, touched nothing. In the second wagon, her fingers found a knot tied in a hitch her dead husband had taught her on their wedding night. Below it, cut low into the wood, 3 initials and a single year waited, where a knife had carved them long ago. They were her husband's initials, and the year was 15 years before she had ever known his name. The night Silas Whitmore died, the clock on the mantel kept ticking. That was the thing Elowen would remember longest. Not the last rattle in his chest. Not the way his hand went cool inside hers. The clock, ticking on. As if the world had not just ended in a back bedroom in the town of Hollowbrook. She sat by the bed until the neighbors came. And then she sat by the bed while the neighbors came. And they were kind in the way people are kind when they are already thinking about supper. 8 years of marriage, 3 months of dying, and a house that smelled of camphor and pine smoke and the slow, patient work of a lung giving up. She was 36 years old. She had no children. That last fact in the town of Hollowbrook in the autumn of 1886 was the only fact about her that anyone would remember. The knock at the front door came before the body was cold. Ambrose Whitmore stood on the porch in a good black coat, the kind a man buys for funerals and then keeps clean for the next one. He held a leather folio under one arm. He did not ask to come in. He came in. Elowen. He nodded at her the way a man nods at a stranger holding a horse he means to buy. I'm sorry for your loss. He's still in there. I know. He's not even cold. I know that too. Ambrose set the folio down on the kitchen table. He did not sit. But there's a matter that won't wait, and I'd rather you hear it from family than from a lawyer. Family. She almost laughed. In 8 years, Ambrose had crossed her threshold 4 times. 3 of them for funerals. He opened the folio. He turned a page toward her. He tapped it with one clean fingernail. The Whitmore entailment, he said. Signed by our great-grandfather in 1811. Every man in this family signs it when he comes of age. Silas signed it the year he turned 22. I don't know what that is. It's what keeps our land in Whitmore hands. He said it gently. He said it the way you explain a fence line to a slow child. The house, the pasture, the water rights, the timber lot. None of it passes to a widow. None of it passes outside the blood. I'm his wife. You were his wife. Now you're a widow. And a widow with no child by him has no standing under the entailment. That's not my rule, Elowen. That's a document older than either of us. She looked at the page. The ink was brown with age. The signature at the bottom was Silas's. She knew his hand the way she knew her own breathing. He had signed it. He had signed it and never told her. When? She said. When did he sign? When did he know? That if he died first. That if we didn't have. She could not finish it. She could never finish it. He always knew. Ambrose folded the page back into the folio. That's how the entailment works. Every man knows. It's meant to. It's meant to make a man careful about the woman he marries, and the sons he gets on her. Careful. The word sat in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. How long do I have? Till the end of the week. He dies on Tuesday, and I'm out by Sunday. Mother thought Saturday. I talked her up to Sunday. Mother. Adelaide Whitmore, 61 years old. A face carved by wind, and grievance in equal measure. Elowen had called her mother once, at the wedding, and Adelaide had smiled the smile of a woman biting a lemon and said, "You may call me Mrs. Whitmore." For 8 years that had been the name. Ambrose left. He did not look at the bedroom door on his way out, which was, Elowen thought later, the closest thing to grief anyone in that family would allow itself. She buried her husband on Thursday. The whole town came. That was the strange part. The whole town came, and they wore their good clothes, and they lowered their voices at the graveside, and they said, "He was a good man." And then they went home, and by Friday morning the story had already changed shape. She heard it at the well first. 2 women, backs to her. They did not know she was there. 8 years and not a child. Not one. Well, you know what they say. I don't say it. I don't hold with saying it. But you know what they say. A womb like that. Poor Silas. Takes something out of a man. A woman who can't give him what a woman's meant to give. Drains him. Drains him. That's the word. Elowen stood behind the pump house, with a full bucket at her feet. She did not move. She did not breathe. She waited until the women went away. And then she picked up her bucket and walked home. And the water sloshed over her boots the whole way. And she could not remember, later, whether she had cried or not. She thought probably not. She had done most of her crying already. By Saturday the word had a name. Black Widow. Adelaide made it official on Sunday morning. Elowen had gone to the church because a widow was expected to go to the church. She had put on her one good dress. She had sat in the 3rd pew from the back. She had bowed her head at the right places, and she had sung the hymns in a voice too tight to carry. The Reverend Cashin Fenner preached on the parable of the barren fig tree. Elowen understood, halfway through the 2nd verse, that the sermon was for her. She sat very still. She kept her eyes on her hands. Some things you sit through because to walk out is to prove the sermon right. After the last amen, Adelaide rose in her own pew. Front row. Whitmore pew. The one the family had paid for in 1849. She turned. She faced the back of the church. She waited for silence. She got it fast. "My son Silas is in the ground," Adelaide said. Her voice did not shake. It never did. He was a good man. He worked hard. He kept his word. He asked little of this life. The congregation nodded. The congregation was practiced at nodding. He asked one thing of the woman he married. And it is the thing every man asks. And she did not give it to him. Elowen did not move. Could not move. The dress was suddenly too tight across her chest, and the air in the church was suddenly too thin. I do not say she did it on purpose. Adelaide's voice softened. It got worse when it softened. I do not say a woman chooses to be what she is. But I say this. A house without children is a cold house. And a man in a cold house dies faster than a man in a warm one. And my son died. And I know what killed him. And it was not his lungs. The room did not breathe. The Reverend did not stop her. That was the part Elowen would remember. Not the words. The Reverend, standing in his pulpit with his hands folded. Not stopping her. I have nothing against Elowen Whitmore, Adelaide said, and turned her head just enough to find Elowen's face. May God comfort her. May God provide for her. May God, in His mercy, give her whatever peace a woman like her can find. A woman like her. Elowen stood up. She did not know she was going to stand up until she was standing. Her legs did it without her, and she walked, not fast, not slow, down the center aisle of the Hollowbrook meeting house on a Sunday morning, with the eyes of every soul she had ever nodded to on the boardwalk fixed on her back. And she pushed open the double doors. And she walked out into the October cold. And behind her, softly, the organ began the closing hymn, as though nothing at all had happened. She did not go back to the church. She did not go back to any church. Not for a long, long time. By Sunday afternoon, Elowen Whitmore had packed everything she owned into 2 saddlebags and a rolled-up quilt. She stood in the front room, where her husband's body had lain a week before. The clock on the mantel was still ticking. Adelaide had already sent a man to carry it out. She took nothing that was Whitmore. She took her wedding ring. She took a small tintype of Silas at 29, the year they had married. She took the coat he had worn in the last winter of his health, wool the color of wet slate, too big for her by half. And she took Juniper. The mare was 16 years old, a bay with a white star on her forehead gone the yellow of old ivory. She had been Silas's before she was anyone's. On his last morning, in the small clear hour, when the fever loosened its grip, and he had known her face, he had said, "Take Junie. She knows the way home." She had asked him, "Home where?" And he had smiled. And he had closed his eyes. And he had not opened them again. Ambrose watched her from the porch as she led the mare down the drive. He did not wave. Adelaide did not come out at all. And Elowen did not look back. Not once. She had learned by then that looking back was for people who still had somewhere to look back to. She had $6.40 in her pocket. She had a mare and a coat and a ring and a picture. She had 36 years of a life the town of Hollowbrook was already busy forgetting. Halloran's livery took her in, not out of kindness, out of the fact that Halloran needed a hand who could muck stalls and would not ask for wages, and Elowen, in the loft above the stable, needed a place to sleep that did not cost her the last of her 40 cents. She washed dishes at the Cornerstone Hotel for her supper. She swept the boardwalk in front of the Mercantile for a nickel. She learned, in 6 weeks, the shape of what a woman becomes when a town decides she is nothing. The loft was cold. The loft was dusty. The loft had a gap in the boards, through which she could see the horses below, and, more to the point, through which the horses' warmth rose. She slept with her coat on, and Silas's tintype in her palm, and Juniper directly below her, and she told herself that was enough. And most nights it was. She learned that a person who says little and listens much is rarely charged for the privilege. She learned that men will speak in front of a woman the way they will not speak in front of a wall. As if her ears were not ears. As if her silence were consent. She learned, without being told, the small architecture of debt in Hollowbrook. Who owed Draker and did not know it yet. Who had signed papers they had not read, and would find out only when the note came due. She learned that Draker did not lend money to enemies. He lent money to friends. And he waited. She learned that Ambrose came to the Cornerstone every Tuesday and Thursday and always sat at Draker's table. And that when Ambrose left, he left through the side door, as if there were reasons not to be seen leaving through the front. She learned that Adelaide had already begun to speak of remarrying. Not herself, Ambrose, to the Whitcomb girl, the one whose father owned the West pasture. The pasture that would, if joined to Whitmore land, make the whole East Valley a single holding. Elowen washed her dishes. She said nothing. She saw everything. And on a wet night in the second week of October, with the lamps guttering in the hotel dining room, and the rain drumming on the tin porch roof, she learned about the wagons. A freighter had come down from the eastern camps. A big man with a red beard and hands like split hams. He warmed those hands over the stove, and he laughed a great deal at his own stories. And halfway through his second plate of stew he said the thing that changed everything. "Old Ridge Road," he said. "Up Silver Peak. You know it?" "Nobody goes up it," said the drover across from him. "Nobody comes down it either." The freighter grinned. "That's the joke of it. 6 wagons went up in the spring of '61. 18 souls. Never once down." The room laughed the way rooms laugh at a story they have already heard. Elowen stood at the sideboard, with a plate half dried in her hands. She said, "Where does it start?" She had not meant to speak. She had gone 6 weeks in that room without speaking. But the question was out of her before she could catch it. The freighter turned in his chair. He looked at her the way certain men look at a woman who has asked a question they think belongs to them. "Beg pardon, missus? The Ridge Road." Where does it start? He laughed. The whole table laughed with him. Above the last switchback beyond the larch fork. Climbs up into country that gives nothing back. He took a long pull of his coffee. The mountain keeps what it takes, missus. That's an old saying and a true one. You planning a picnic? The men at the far table were watching now. At the head of the long table, a broad man in a fawn-colored waistcoat set down his fork. Cornelius Draker, 62 years old. Owner of the Hollowbrook Bank and Trust. Owner of the Cornerstone Hotel. Owner of the note that Ambrose had signed to buy out Elowen's dower right for $80 and a promise. Owner, in some way she could not yet name, of most of the town. He looked at her down the length of the table. He did not smile. He did not need to. His mouth already sat in a shape that made smiling redundant. Going up alone, Mrs. Whitmore? It was not a question. He had a way of saying things that made agreement feel like surrender. She met his eyes. I hadn't decided. Then decide against it. He lifted his fork again. The mountain will keep you. Save the county the cost of another eviction. The table laughed. The table laughed, and the laughter followed her out into the street, and the rain came down cold, and straight through her husband's coat, and found the skin beneath. She stood a long moment by the livery door, with her hands shaking. Not from fear, or so she told herself. From the effort of keeping her mouth shut. From the knowledge that any answer she gave would only feed them. And it was there, in the dark between the livery and the wheelwright's shop, that a hand closed on her sleeve. The old woman was small and stooped. A shawl the color of old with smoke pulled up over her hair. Her face in the last of the lamplight was a country map of lines. Her eyes were the pale gray blue of river ice just before it breaks. Mercy Halloway. That was her name. Everyone in Hollowbrook knew it. No one seemed to know anything else. She lived in a low turf and timber house behind the churchyard, and children dared each other to knock on her door and run, and mothers told their little ones not to stare. She looked up into Elowen's face now, and her fingers on Elowen's sleeve were cold and light as a bird's foot. Child. Elowen waited. What they left on that mountain was not lost. The voice was low and even and worn smooth as a creek stone. It was kept. Mind which one you become. And then she turned and was gone. Down the alley toward the churchyard. Quick and quiet as a thought. And Elowen stood in the rain, with the old woman's words settling into her, turning them over, unable to fit them to any door she knew. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the loft above the horses, and listened to Juniper stamp and shift below her, and she thought about the freighter's laughter, and Draker's fork lifting, and Mercy's cold hand on her sleeve. And under all of it, quieter but louder for being quieter, she thought about Silas. Silas, who had never once in 8 years of marriage spoken of the mountains above Hollowbrook. Silas, who had come into her life at 29, riding down out of nowhere on this same mare, and had taken work at the sawmill, and never spoken of where he had been before. Silas, who every year on the 3rd of September had walked down to the Bitterroot River alone, and sat all night by the water, and had come home in the morning with red eyes and would not say why. She had asked him once, early, when she still thought a wife had a right to ask. He had said, I was somewhere I can't go back to, and she had let it lie, and she had never asked again. And in 8 years she had built a whole life on the far side of a silence, and told herself that a woman who loves a man learns to love what he cannot say. Now, in the loft, in the dark, with the town's word for her sitting on her chest like a hand pressing down, now she wondered. She had thought, in her worst moments, that Silas's silence was about her, that he had married a woman he could not quite love, that the barrenness of her body was a punishment for some coldness in her spirit she had not yet learned to name. She had believed all the things the town believed. She had believed them longer than the town had. But Mercy's words came back to her, low and clear. Mind which one you become. And Elowen understood, with a suddenness that felt almost like anger, that there were 2 roads a person could walk out of a grief like this. The one that stayed inside the story the town told about her. and the one that walked up the mountain and asked the mountain itself for a different story. She did not sleep, but she made her choice before the roosters began. In the morning she went to the wheelwright. Josiah Penn had kept his shop at the low end of Hollowbrook for 38 years. His hands showed it, broad and seamed, and permanently darkened at the knuckles, from iron and pine tar. He was 71 years old, and he moved slow, and he saw everything. She came in meaning only to buy a coil of good rope and a hoof pick. She counted her coins on his counter. $6.40 was down to $4.11 now. He watched her count. He said nothing about the ridge until the rope was already looped over her shoulder. Then he said, "Your husband." She looked up. He said, "A knot on a grain sack that I never once saw another hand match." She waited. Josiah took a scrap of hide from a nail above his bench and unrolled it on the wood. On it, in faded brown ink, someone had drawn a line climbing past 3 creek crossings to a wide place marked with a small square. Around the square, a scatter of dots that might have been stones, or might have been anything. "Fellow left this here a long time ago," he said. "Never came back for it. I always meant to burn it. Never could." Elowen looked at the line, and the square, and the dots. Something moved behind her ribs. "Why give it to me?" "Because you're the first person in 3 months to ask a plain question about that country instead of a joke." He pressed the scrap into her hand and closed her fingers over it with both of his. "Missus," he said. Then he stopped. Then he tried again. "Did Silas ever tell you where he learned to tie that knot?" "He told me it was his father's." Josiah looked at her a long moment. His face did a slow small thing that was not quite a smile. "His father." He nodded. "Well, that's one way to say it." "What's another?" He did not answer. He looked out the window at the sky above the false fronts of the street, where a high thin band of cloud had begun to reach in from the west like fingers spread over a lamp. "Weather's turning," he said. "Whatever it looks like down here, when the cloud comes off Silver Peak flat on the bottom and torn on the top, you find cover and you don't argue with it. That country makes its own storms and keeps its own out." She started to ask again. "About the knot. About Silas." He put a hand up. "Gentle. Go up," he said. "See what's up there. Come back down. Then ask me. Because you won't believe the answer until you've seen the question." She left. She did not look back. Because she was afraid that if she looked back, she would find a reason to stay. And there was no longer anything in Hollowbrook to stay for. She rode out at dawn on the 2nd Monday of October. She left before the town was awake, because she did not want to give Draker, or Adelaide or any of them the satisfaction of watching her go. Juniper picked her way down the wet main street, with her ears forward, and her breath white in the cold. And Elowen sat, with the reins loose in her open palm. And she did not look at the houses she passed. And she thought about the shape of the word home, and how it had been Silas's last word to her, and how she had spent every day since trying to understand it. The road out of Hollowbrook climbed slowly for the first hour, and then not slowly at all. By noon she was above the last of the fenced pasture. By late afternoon she was above the last of the ranches. By dusk of the first day she was in the timber, and the road under Juniper's hooves had thinned, from a wagon track to a horse trail to a roomer. She camped that night under a leaning cedar, and did not light a fire. She ate cold biscuit and a strip of dried venison. She drank from her canteen, and the water tasted of tin. Above her the stars came out hard, and clean and, without number, so many of them, that the timber's black edge seemed the rim of a great bowl brimming with light. And she thought, not for the first time, that she had nothing left the world could take from her. And she thought that this ought to have frightened her more than it did. She slept. She did not dream. She woke to a frost that had silvered the cedar, and her own blanket, and the mare's dark mane. She rubbed Juniper's white star, and the mare leaned into it, patient, old, 16 if she was a day. And Elowen said out loud, because there was no one to hear, "You knew this road, Didn't you, Junie? All along. You knew. The mare did not answer, but she picked her way up the trail, as though she had walked it before. The second day the country changed. The pines thinned. Granite pushed up bare and gray through the thin soil. The air grew sharper and cleaner until Elowen could almost taste the shape of the mountain.
Pinasap.
Old snow. And under both, the mineral cold of stone that has never once been warm all the way through. A jay called once from a snag. Nothing answered it. She crossed the first creek at a stony ford. The second an hour on. Near midday she came to the third, wider than the others, running fast and clear, over a bed of pale rounded rock. She got down and let Juniper drink. She drank herself, kneeling on a flat stone. It was climbing back up the near bank that she saw the country open ahead of her, and knew, before she reached it, that she had come to the place on the hide. The meadow opened without warning. The timber simply stepped back on both sides. The ground leveled and ran out flat. And there before her, in the last long slant of the afternoon light, lay a shallow bowl of grass under the wide pale sky, ringed all around by dark standing timber, still as a held breath. Late frost lay unmelted in the shadow of the trees, and in the middle of that stillness, drawn up in a rough half-circle, stood 6 shapes she had ridden 2 days to find, and had more than half expected never to find at all. She drew Juniper up at the meadow's edge, and did not dismount. For a long moment she only looked. She had told herself the freighter's tale would prove a tale. She had told herself she would find splinters, rusted iron rims, a scatter of bleached bone, the ordinary leavings of an ordinary disaster 25 years gone. What she saw instead stopped the breath in her throat. 6 covered wagons, standing in the grass, their canvas tops sagged and weathered to the gray of driftwood, but still stretched over the bows, their tongues resting down in the sod, as though the teams had only just been unhooked and led off to water, and would be back before the light failed. She swung down, slowly. Juniper did not follow at first. The mare stood, with her ears pricked hard forward, and her nostrils working, reading something on the still air that Elowen could not read. Elowen laid a hand flat on the warm slope of the mare's neck and waited, and while the horse stepped, after her one careful hoof, and then another, the way a horse steps into water she does not trust. The nearest wagon was a plain box on iron-strapped wheels. The canvas had a long tear near the front bow, where a quarter-century of wind had worked at a weak seam. Through the tear, in the slanting afternoon light, Elowen could see the shapes of the things a family carries, when it means to make a new life at the far end of a long road. A flour barrel, a cast-iron pot lashed to a rib, with a length of rope gone stiff and gray, a folded quilt faded to the pale of dust, but still folded, still square, still stacked as though the hands that stacked it had known someone would one day need to see it done right. A child's wooden horse lay tipped on its side atop a crate. His painted eye had long since worn away. Something in Elowen's chest went very still at the sight of it. The way a room goes still when a clock that has ticked all your life stops. She did not touch anything. She walked the circle instead, slow, her boots hushing through the frost-stiffened grass. And every wagon told her the same impossible thing. Ropes still knotted, boxes still packed, a tin coffee pot set upright on a driver's seat, as though someone had put it there to keep it from tipping and had turned away for the space of a breath, and simply never turned back. In one bed, a pair of small leather shoes stood side by side, their laces tied in careful bows, waiting for feet that had grown or gone. In another, an open book lay face down on a folded shawl, its pages yellowed but uncurled, sheltered from 25 mountain winters by nothing but canvas and grace. No bones, no blood, no mark of struggle anywhere in that meadow. No scatter, no ruin, no sign of any human thing at all except the wagons and what they held, as though 18 souls had stepped out of the grass together between one breath and the next, and walked off into the trees, and simply not come back. Elowen sat down. Her knees would not hold her. Juniper came and stood over her and lowered her long head. And Elowen put her forehead against the warm bone of the mare's jaw and stayed there, while her heart slowed. And the meadow held its silence around them both. What manner of disaster leaves the pots still hanging? What manner of people walk away from everything they own and never return? She did not have the answers. She had, for the first time in 3 months, the feeling that the questions had been waiting a very long time for someone to ask them. She made her camp that evening at the outer edge of the half-circle, picketed Juniper, pulled the saddle, unrolled her blanket in the lee of the first wagon. She did not build a fire. She was not ready yet to bring flame into that circle, though she could not have said why. She lay on her back, with her hat over her eyes and listened. The mare cropping grass, an owl somewhere back in the timber, a single stone shifting in the creek at the meadow's western edge. She thought of Silas. She thought of the way he had held her, the night the doctor had told them that whatever it was inside her that made a child, it was not going to make one. She had cried into the collar of his shirt, and she had said, over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," and he had held her a very long time, and he had said, "Elowen, look at me, look at me, you are enough, you have always been enough." And she had believed him for 8 years, and she had stopped believing him the moment he stopped breathing. Because a widow with no child, in a town like Hollowbrook, is not a woman who has been loved. She is a woman who has failed at the one thing a woman is for. The stars came out over the meadow, and Elowen lay in the grass among the 6 silent wagons. And she thought about the man who had drifted down out of the mountains 9 years before she ever met him on the very mare who now grazed at her picket. And she thought about a not no other hand could match, and a father who was not the answer Josiah had almost given. She woke once before dawn, a low creak from the wagon nearest her, as though a body had shifted its weight inside. She lay still with her eyes open and her hand on the knife at her belt. The sound did not come again. Dawn came slowly to the high country. The stars faded one by one. A thin milk-colored light filled the bowl of the meadow before the sun itself cleared the ridge. Elowen sat up. She folded her blanket. She walked once around the circle in the new light, to see it all again, to know she had not dreamed it. She stopped at the second wagon. It was smaller than the first, its box narrower, its bows drawn tighter. She set her hand flat on the cold damp wood of the wheel and felt the grain of it under her palm, older than she was. And something drew her to fold back the corner of the canvas, where a leather thong had been looped through a brass grommet and tied off. The knot stopped her hand. She knew that knot. She had watched it 100 times, 1,000. Made fast over grain sacks, and feed and the tailgate of a hay wagon by hands she would have known in the dark. Silas had taught her the trick of it on their wedding night. He had laughed at her clumsy fingers. He had guided her hand until she had it. He had said, "Now you can tie down anything the world tries to blow away from you." She had made him promise it was a family knot, that his father had taught him. He had gone quiet a long moment, and then he had said, "Yes, my father taught me." She had not asked which father. She had not known there was more than one kind. She crouched in the wet grass, with her fingers on the knot. She did not move. She could not move. And then, slowly, she worked it loose. Inside, the light was the color of weak tea. A bedroll along one side still rolled and tied. A carpet bag at its foot, folded once atop the bag. A man's shirt of undyed linen, the collar frayed soft, the cuffs mended in small, even stitches by a patient hand. She let her eyes travel slowly over what the wagon held. A whetstone in a shallow wooden dish, a coil of new hemp rope gone gray, a candle burned down to a thumb's length in a tin holder, and hung from a hook driven into the second bough, a man's felt hat, black once, faded now to the color of wood smoke. She was turning to climb back down when she saw the mark. It was cut into the inner face of the sideboard, low, no higher than her knee where she crouched. Someone had scratched it there with a blade point, patient and small and deep. A cross. Beside the cross, 3 letters. Below the letters, a number. Elowen went very still. She read the letters once. And then again to be certain the dawn light was not deceiving her. The 3 letters were S. W. Cut plain and sure into the wood. The number below them was 1861. Silas Whitmore. 15 years before he had ever spoken her name. 22 years old and hired on as an outrider on a train of 6 wagons that had gone up a mountain and never come down. She sat back in the wet grass. Silas had been 47 years old when he died. She counted it now. 22 in 1861. 47 in 1886. The math was clean. The math was cruel. The math meant that the man she had married at 28 had already been carrying this meadow for 15 years by the time she met him. He had been up here, some part of him, always. He had never come all the way down. She thought of the 3rd of September. Every year, the river, his red eyes in the morning. She had asked once, only once, and he had said, "It's the anniversary of a debt I couldn't pay." And she had touched his hand and asked no more, because a wife who loves her husband learns which questions to leave in the water. She had thought she was being wise. She had been being afraid. She pressed her palm flat against the carved letters. The way she had once pressed her palm flat against her husband's forehead in the last hour, before the fever took the last of his knowing. She said, out loud to the wagon, to the mountain, to the man, who had been dead 3 months, and had suddenly, terribly, never quite been, who he said he was, "Oh, Silas." Just that. "Oh, Silas, what did you do?" The sun cleared the eastern ridge, and struck the dew on the meadow grass, and turned the whole silent bowl, for one long trembling minute, into a field of small white fire. Somewhere behind her, in the second wagon, the old canvas gave a small dry creak in the strengthening light, as though the wagon itself had been holding its breath, and had just now, at last, let it out. Elowen did not turn. She sat with her palm on the wood, and her eyes on the sunrise, and she made her first vow to the meadow. She did not speak it aloud. She did not have to. Whatever her husband had left up here, whatever he had carried down alone, and never once been able to set down, she would find it. She would carry it home, and she would learn, at last, the name of the debt he had never been able to pay. She did not sleep the rest of that morning. She worked, because work was the one language grief had never been able to take from her. She lifted the corner of the quilt in the first wagon. Just the corner. And underneath, tucked against the sideboard, where the shifting of the wagon, over 25 winters had not been able to reach it, sat a wooden box. Dovetailed at the corners, 2 small brass hinges. A hasp. No look. Somebody had made it with time. Somebody had made it to last. She carried it out into the sun. She set it on the folded quilt on a flat rock. She sat down beside it, and she did not open it for a long while, because some doors, once opened, do not close again. She opened it. Inside, a folded square of oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth, a leather-bound ledger, and beneath the ledger, a bundle of letters tied, with a length of linen tape that had once been white, and was now the gray of everything else the mountain kept. She took the ledger out first. The letters could wait. The letters felt private. The ledger felt like a record, and a record was a thing a person was permitted to read. She turned back the cover. On the first page, in a careful sloping hand, were names. 18 of them, entered one below another, with an age beside each and the family it belonged to. 2 men in their 40s, 3 wives, 11 children, the youngest an infant of 4 months, the eldest a girl of 15, and at the bottom of the list, set apart under his own line, as though he belonged to no family, and to all of them a young man of 22, hired on as outrider at the last settlement east of the pass, to earn his passage west. The initials beside that last line were S. W. Elowen closed her eyes. She had already known. She had known since the sideboard. But knowing a thing, and seeing it written in a stranger's careful hand are two different weights. And the second weight came down on her slow and total. She sat on the rock, with her hand on the page, and the sun climbing over the meadow. And she said very softly to no one, "You were the boy. You were the one who rode down." The wind moved through the grass. It did not answer. She turned the pages. The early entries were the ordinary music of a wagon train making distance. Weather, miles made, a ford crossed at the second creek. A wheel repaired by the young outrider, noted with a small approving line, as though the writer had been glad to have him along. The hand was steady, unhurried. A woman's hand, Elowen thought, from the shape of it. It went on that way for pages, calm, dutiful, until the entry made 10 days out from the meadow. And there it changed. The ink grew heavier. The letters drew closer together, crowding, as though the hand that made them had begun to hurry, or to shake. A spring 3 miles above the meadow, drunk from by 2 of the children before anyone thought to test it. By nightfall the 2 were unwell, and by morning 3 more of the little ones were ailing, and one of the wives had taken to her bed. The families had made camp in the meadow to let the sick rest, and to keep the well away from the poisoned spring. And there they had stayed. Elowen read on, and as she read, a quiet relief settled over her like the cool of evening. Because the writer, whoever she had been a woman who thought first of the children, and the pages proved it. Line by line, the little ones were kept warm. The little ones were given only the good water carried up from the creek below. The little ones, one by one, across the crowded entries were noted as easier, as resting quiet, as taking broth, as sitting up, as mending. Every child in the roster had come through the worst of it on the mend. Elowen pressed her palm against the page, because for the first time, since she had swung down from the mare, she understood one true thing about this meadow. Whatever had happened here, whatever the town below had made of it, the hands in this train had held their children close and safe through every hour of it. She read the last entry. It was short, dated 3 days after the first fever. The road ahead had closed, with an early snow at the pass. The road behind was a full week on foot for people with weary children who could not sit a jolting wagon. The young outrider had offered to ride down alone by the deer trail, fast and light, to bring back help and a doctor. He had gone at first light, with the one horse still fit for the descent, and no saddle, to spare the weight. The rest of them, the well and the mending both, would start down together on foot at dawn, carrying the smallest children who could not walk, leaving behind everything that could be left, so that they might all come out of the high country together, before the next snow closed the deer trail also. If God was willing, they would come back up, within the fortnight to gather what they had set down. It was signed, with a woman's name Elowen did not know, a name in the same steady hand that had kept every entry. She closed the ledger. She sat with it on her knees. She looked out at the 6 wagons standing in the sun, and the whole shape of the thing came together in her at once. Silas had been the outrider. Silas at 22 had ridden down that eastern trail alone and light, to bring help back to 18 people who were counting on his return. The others had drawn their wagons into an open arc that meant we are waiting, and they had gathered the little ones and started down on their own weary feet. And somewhere between the meadow and the world below, the two halves of that hope had missed each other. In a country that gave nothing back. She did not know, yet, whether the families had reached the valley safe, or lost the trail in the snow. But she knew, the way she knew her own hands, what it had done to a young man to ride down for help, and turn back at the bottom to find the trail behind him empty and silent. No wagons following. No voices calling. Only the mountain and its long, indifferent silence. She knew why a man like that would carry that emptiness the whole rest of his life, and never speak of it. Why he would keep his own counsel. Why he would drift for years without a home. Why he would come down at last, into a town at the foot of a ridge road he could never bring himself to ride again, and take a job at the sawmill, and marry a woman gently, late, only after he had convinced himself he was not, could never be, allowed the kind of joy that made children. I don't deserve to have a family, not after 18 of them. That had been the arithmetic in her husband's chest. For 25 years. And she, Elowen Whitmore, 36 years old, 3 months a widow, a woman who had spent 8 years believing her body was the reason her house was quiet. She had not been the reason. She had never been the reason. She pressed the closed ledger against her chest, and bowed her head over it. And for the first time since the fever, she wept. Quietly, without any sound at all. The way her husband must have wept 100 nights. In the front room, with the clock ticking, and his wife asleep in the next room. Believing him only quiet, only tired, only Silas. And not a man carrying a whole train of the lost inside his chest. She wept until the sun was high. Then she wiped her face on the sleeve of his coat. And she stood up. And she went back to work. Because grief was a well. And work was a bucket. And the only way through was to keep drawing. She spent the rest of that day on the wagons. She cut 2 straight saplings at the meadow's edge and trimmed them into props. She set them under the sagging tongue of the 3rd wagon. She eased it up out of the sod an inch at a time. When the wood came free, it was black on the underside but sound. She scraped the black away with the back of her knife. She let the clean air get at it. She moved to the 4th. She did the same. By mid-morning she had sweated, through her shirt in the thin, cold air. She went down to the creek. She drank. And when she stood and turned back toward the wagons, she saw them from a new angle, and saw the thing she had not seen the day before. The half-circle was not a half-circle at all. It was an arc, drawn with care, and it had been drawn to leave a wide clear opening toward the east, toward the way she had come, toward the trail down. She had seen enough of the country, and heard enough of its stories to know how folk drew their wagons up when they feared attack. Tight and closed, wheel to wheel, a ring with no way in. This was the opposite of that. Whoever had set these wagons in this meadow had not been circling against anything. They had left the roadside open. On purpose. They had been keeping the door open. They had been waiting for someone to come back up. She sat down on a cold flat stone by the creek, because she understood now what the arc meant. Her husband had ridden back up. She was sure of it. He had come back, alone. Once the storm cleared, he had ridden up the deer trail. He had come out into this meadow, and he had found the wagons here, and no one else. And he had believed the wrong thing. He had believed the mountain had taken them. He had believed his slowness had cost 18 lives. He had ridden down, and he had kept riding, for 25 years. And the whole time the door had been open for him, and he had not been able to see it. Elowen put her head in her hands. Silas, oh Silas, you should have told me. I would have ridden up here with you. I would have held the lamp. I would have, she stopped herself, because that was the widow's oldest trick. To live inside the sentence that begins with I would have. And she was done living there. She would live from now on inside the sentence that began with I will. She stayed a second night in the meadow, and a third. She emptied 2 of the wagons entirely, set their contents in orderly rows in the grass. She made, without ever choosing to, the beginnings of a record. The mended wooden horse, the one with the small iron pin driven crosswise through a broken leg. The kind of repair a father does by lantern light after a child has cried herself to sleep, so that the first thing she sees in the morning is the thing made whole again. Elowen held that little horse in her open palm a long time before she set it down. She thought of the iron pin driven crosswise through her own husband's silence, the way he had mended himself around some old break she had never been let to see. She slept better the second night, woke calmer, started the third day with something like a plan, which was, of course, the day the sky broke. The clouds came up over the western ridge in the middle of the afternoon, flat on the bottom, torn on the top, exactly as Josiah Penn had drawn them for her in the air of his shop. You find cover, and you don't argue with it. She moved. She lashed torn canvas. She hauled the folded quilts out of the wet grass and back into the wagon beds. She dragged her saddle under the lee of the third wagon's tongue. She got Juniper's picket into the sheltered angle, where the wind could not reach her. The wind rose. The rain came sidelong, came in ropes, came in walls. It came the way rain comes at 8,000 feet, when the mountain decides to remind you what it is. She was bent to the last knot on the fourth wagon, her cold fingers fumbling the wet rope, when she heard, under the wind, the sound that changed everything the meadow had already asked of her. A voice, low and broken and human, calling from somewhere down the eastern trail, out past the open arc of the wagons, out in the streaming dark, where the door had been left standing open for 25 years. Elowen froze, her cold hand on the rope. The rain came down. The voice came again, closer now, and this time she was sure of the shape of the word it carried. The word was help. She dropped the wet rope. She went toward the voice, not away from it, and the choosing of that direction, that single choice, was the first thing she had done since the meadow that felt entirely her own. She ran with one hand out before her, past the tongue of the fourth wagon, past the picket, where the mare wheeled and called after her, out to the eastern edge, where the grass gave way to the broken lip of the trail. A man was down on his knees in the streaming grass. He had come up the trail she had ridden, and he had fallen the last few yards of it. He knelt now with his head bowed and his shoulders heaving. Against his chest, half sheltered under the sodden wing of his coat, he held a small shape wrapped in a blanket that had long since soaked through. The child in his arms was awake, turned its face against the man's collar, made a small sound that was tiredness and fright and nothing worse than either. That single sound told Elowen more than any word the man could have given her. She reached them, went to her knees in the mud, without a thought for herself. The man lifted his face to her. It was the face of a person who has walked past the far end of everything he had. His lip was split and crusted, his eyes red-rimmed and wide. Rain ran off his beard in a steady thread. My wife, the words came broken, chattering through the cold. Back down the trail, her leg, the shale gave under her. Elowen did not waste breath on questions the dark could not answer. She got her arm under the child. The small weight came away from the man easily. Can you walk? She had already caught the man under the elbow with her free hand, was already hauling upward. He came up in stages, like a foundered horse rising. Stood swaying, nodded. She got them both to the third wagon, where the mare stood in the lee, with the rain running off her flanks in ropes. She set the boy inside on the driest of the folded quilts she had hauled up out of the weather an hour before. She peeled the soaked blanket off him, wrapped him instead in the dry wool, tucking it close under his chin. And she took the smoke-gray felt hat, from where she had stowed it, and set it over his wet hair, because it was the driest thing left, within her reach. It swallowed his head near to the nose. Under the drooping brim she saw his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of the idea of one. Something in her chest loosened by a single notch. There now. She spoke low, the way she gentled the mare. You're out of it. You're inside now. The man had followed her in, stood dripping, his hands hanging useless at his sides. Elowen turned him toward the quilt, with a hand flat on his back. Sit with him. Keep him against you. Share what heat you've got left. She was already pulling the cinch loose on the mare's saddle. How far to your wife? A mile. His voice cracked on it. Less, maybe. There's a place the trail runs out onto the bare shale. She's off the edge of it. In the trees below. I couldn't carry her and the boy both. I had to choose which one I could. You chose right. She swung the wet saddle off. Let it drop. A man who can only carry one carries the one who can't be left. You brought me the one who could tell me where to find the other. She looked at him hard, through the streaming dark. Now you keep that boy warm, and you don't move from this wagon, whatever you hear out there. The man's face broke. He nodded. He climbed up into the wagon bed and gathered the boy against him, and the boy burrowed into him. Elowen did not let herself look long. She swung up onto the bare wet back of the mare. Lead rope wound once around her fist. She pointed the horse's nose down the eastern trail, into the dark, and the rain, down the very road her husband had ridden 25 years before, with the same errand pulling her, and the same night closing behind. Juniper went down carefully, feeling for each step, her hooves finding the old ruts under the running water. The rain had turned the trail to a black ribbon, and twice the mare checked hard and refused, and both times Elowen let her, because a horse that will not go forward on a mountain in the dark is not being stubborn. She is being right. She smelled the shale before she saw it, a mineral flatness in the wet air, where the timber thinned. Then the trees fell back, and the trail ran out onto a long pale scar of broken rock that even in the dark held a faint sheen of its own. She drew the mare up at the edge of it. The shale sloped away to her left, down and down, a whole hillside of loose plate gone treacherous with rain. She got down, left the mare standing, went out onto the shale on foot, testing each stone before she trusted it. The loose rock shifting and clattering under her boots, sliding away into the dark below, with a sound like slow applause. She went to her knees, where the slope steepened, worked her way down with her hands, calling into the rain. The wind took her voice and gave nothing back. She called again, and a third time, was drawing breath to call a fourth, when a sound came up to her from below. Thin and spent, more breath than word. Here. Elowen followed it down, to where the broken rock spilled, into a stand of stunted pine at the slope's foot. And there, wedged against the trunk of the largest of them, with one hand closed white-knuckled around a root that had reached up out of the bank, as though the mountain itself had put out a hand to hold her, lay the woman. Her leg was turned wrong below the knee. Her face in the dark was drawn and pale, but her eyes, when they found Elowen's face, were clear and fierce, and holding on. My boy! Before anything else. Before her own pain. Before her own name. Did he? He's warm and dry, and safe with your husband up in a wagon a mile above us. Elowen knelt in the wet needles. Put her hand over the woman's cold hand, where it gripped the root. He's all right. He's out of the weather. You held on for him, and he's safe. Now I need you to hold on a while longer. For yourself. The woman's breath went out of her in a long shudder, that was half a sob, and had nothing of self-pity in it. Clemency. She got the name out, through her teeth. I'm Clemency. Elowen. She was already running her hands down the broken leg, reading the wrongness of it, through the wet wool of the woman's skirt. Found the break clean below the knee. A bad thing. But a simple one. The bone turned, but not through the skin. This is going to hurt, Clemency, and I am not going to pretend to you that it won't. Then don't start. Clemency found an edge of dry iron under the pain. Elowen liked her for it at once. Just do it. Elowen cut a straight branch from the stunted pine with the knife at her belt, stripped it, cut a second. She tore the tail of her own shirt into strips with her teeth and her hands. She set the leg, as her husband had once set a colt's cannon bone. With her holding the lamp, talking low and steady the whole time, not about the leg, but about the boy, about the hat that had swallowed his head, about the way he had burrowed into his father. And Clemency held on to it, her jaw locked, her eyes streaming, making no sound she could help, until it was splinted and bound. Getting her up the shale was the labor of a lifetime compressed into a quarter hour. Elowen could not carry her up that shifting slope. No one could have. So she went up first with the mare's lead rope paid out behind her, tied it off to the largest pine, then went back down, got Clemency to her one good foot, and with the rope for the woman to haul on, and Elowen's shoulder under her arm. The two of them fought their way up the loose rock a body length at a time, resting between. By the time they reached the mare at the top, Both women were shaking, and slick with mud to the elbow. They came up the trail slower than Elowen had gone down it. The mare bearing the extra weight, with her ears flat against the rain, and her head low. The meadow opened above them at last. Gray-black under the streaming sky. A low glad cry came from the third wagon as they came into sight of it. And then the pale oval of the boy's face under the drooping brim of the felt hat, peering out at his mother coming home out of the dark. Elowen got Clemency down and into the wagon bed beside her son. The family folded together, the three of them, and the sounds they made were not for Elowen to witness. So she turned away, busied herself with the mare, giving the family the only privacy the meadow could offer, which was her turned back and her averted eyes. She built the meadow's first fire in 25 years. Small, sheltered under the overhang of the third wagon's tailgate. She warmed a strip of the softened venison in the tin coffee pot that had stood on the driver's seat since before she was born, fed it to the boy a bite at a time, until the chill left him and his color came back. She looked at the leg by firelight and rebound it properly. "You do that like you've done it before." Clemency kept her voice low, so as not to wake the boy. "My husband set bone." I held the lamp. Elowen tied off the last binding, sat back on her heels. "He said a splint that hurts is a splint that's holding." "My husband set bone." I held the lamp. Elowen tied off the last binding, sat back on her heels. "He said a splint that hurts is a splint that's holding. I'm sorry to say yours is holding very well." The man had gone quiet across the fire. Now he spoke into it without looking up. His voice had steadied into something Elowen could hear. The man he was underneath the terror of the night. "Ezekiel Ashcroft. That's my wife you carried up a mile of black shale. That's my son you put your own hat on." He lifted his eyes to her. They were wet, and not only from the rain. "We came up from the South Fork settlement, looking for a shorter way over to the Kettle Valley side. A man in the low country told me this old road cut half a week off the path. Told me it was rough, but sound." Elowen's hands went still on the coffee pot. "A man in the low country told you the ridge road was sound. Big fellow, well dressed for that kind of talk. Said folks avoided it out of an old superstition, and no more than that." Ezekiel's brow drew down at whatever he saw in her face. "You know him?" "I might." She set the pot on the coals, with more care than it needed. A cold thing had come into her that had nothing to do with the weather, a small hard suspicion turning over in the dark of her mind, taking a shape she did not yet like. A man in the low country, well dressed, sending strangers up a road the whole of Hollowbrook swore ate its own, sending a family up a road he had sent her up. Not 2 weeks passed, with the same easy contempt. "The mountain will keep you." She did not name the man to Ezekiel Ashcroft. She had no proof, and the night had asked enough of all of them, without her handing a frightened father a suspicion he could do nothing with. But she filed it away, whole and cold, next to the ledger, and the carved letters, and the open Eastern arc. And she felt the thing she had ridden up here to uncover quietly change its shape, from a grief a quarter century old, into something that had a living hand in it still. The storm broke before dawn, the way mountain storms do, all at once and completely. The cloud tore open in the east. The rain stopped between one breath and the next, and the sudden silence woke Elowen, where she sat by the coals. The timber steamed. The meadow lay drowned and glittering. The boy slept on, warm and easy. Clemency had fallen into the gray, shallow sleep of the injured. Ezekiel sat propped against the wagon side, with his son's weight against his arm, gone slack at last into his own exhaustion. Elowen let them all sleep, and went out alone, into the wet dawn to see what the storm had done. The prop tongues had held. The lashings she had fought into place had held. The first wagon, where the dovetailed box lay dry under the quilt, had shed the rain clean. Only at the fifth wagon, the one she had not reached before the weather came, Had the storm found its way in? The old canvas had split along a rotten seam and folded back, and the rain had gotten at what was inside. Elowen climbed up to see what had been lost, expecting spoiled flour, ruined cloth, the small sad damage of one more thing the mountain had been allowed to take. What she found instead, laid bare where the driving rain had washed a quarter-century of dust off it, and shifted a fallen crate aside, was a second box. It was not dovetailed, and fine like the one in the first wagon. It was a plain tin document box, the kind a man might buy for $1 to keep his papers from the damp. Its lid rusted but sound, and it had been wedged down low against the sideboard, under a false floor of loose planking, that the shifting crate had knocked askew. Someone had hidden it. Someone had gone to trouble, that it not be found by a casual hand. Elowen knelt in the wet wagon bed, worked the lid up. The rust shrieked and gave. Inside, dry beneath a wrapping of waxed paper, lay a sheaf of documents. In a hand she was coming to know, the same careful sloping hand that had kept the ledger. She lifted the topmost page into the gray light. She read it, and the cold that had been sitting in her, since Ezekiel spoke of the man in the low country, spread up through her chest, and closed around her heart. It was a claim, a land claim, filed, and witnessed, and stamped, for the whole of the high meadow, and the water that fed it, entered in the names of the two families of the train, dated in the spring of 1861, a full and legal claim, to the very ground she was kneeling on, made by the very people the town below had spent 25 years calling lost. And beneath it, page under page, the papers that made it real, the filing receipt from the Territorial Land Office, the survey lines drawn in the same brown ink as Josiah Penn's scrap of hide, a letter of intent to establish a stock ranch on the meadow water. These people had not been drifting through. They had been coming home. They had filed on this ground, and gone east to gather the last of their kin and their goods. And they had been bringing the whole of two families up to a place that was already, in the eyes of the law, theirs. Elowen sat back on her heels in the wet, understood all at once why a well-dressed man in the low country might send stranger after stranger up a road that killed its reputation. Not from carelessness, not from cruelty for its own sake. A meadow with a standing claim on it could not be sold. A meadow whose claimants had vanished, whose heirs had never come forward, whose very existence had curdled into a ghost story told over coffee, was a meadow a patient man might one day file on as abandoned empty ground, unowned and unwanted, and sell to whoever was buying. Someone she was beginning to see was buying. Someone with money enough to want half a mountain, and the low cunning to make sure no living soul climbed up here to find the papers that would stop him. But she knew, holding those pages in her two hands, with the dawn steaming up off the drowned meadow, that she was holding the thing that turned a quiet grief into a crime, and that the crime was not finished, and that she had ridden up into the middle of it, carrying nothing but a dead man's knot and a stranger's warning about the weather. She wrapped the claim and its papers back in their waxed paper, carried the tin box to the first wagon, set it beside the dovetailed one under the quilt, the record of who these people were, and the proof of what was theirs. Then she went back to the fire, and built it up, because the family would wake cold and hungry, and because her hands needed something ordinary to do, while her mind worked at the enormity of the rest. They stayed in the meadow a second day, and a third, because Clemency could not travel on the leg, and because the mare needed rest before she bore a burden down that trail, and because, though none of them said it, the meadow had begun to work on all of them. The strange held peace of the place, seeping into even the frightened father and the aching mother, so that the days took on the quality of a reprieve none of them had asked for. Ezekiel proved a fair hand, with would once his hands stopped shaking. He and Elowen fashioned a travois from the slats of the storm-opened fifth wagon. Toby, that was the boy's name, 7 this past winter, was everywhere Elowen went, on two sound legs, into the wagons, along the creek, out to the picket, to make grave introductions to the mare. And Elowen, who had not spoken more than a needful word to another soul in 3 months, found herself answering a 7-year-old's endless questions about horses, and knots and the names of birds, and found that it did not tire her the way she would have thought. It was Toby who found the last thing the meadow had to give up. He found it the way children find things, by getting into a place no grown person would have bothered to look. On the second afternoon, while Elowen mended a broken singletree, and Ezekiel rested his blistered hands, the boy climbed up into the second wagon, drawn by the smoke-gray hat's twin, still hanging from its hook, and he wormed himself down into the narrow space behind the seat, where a child could fit and a grown woman could not, and he came out again with dust on his nose and a flat packet in his hand, which he carried to Elowen with the offhand triumph of the young. There was a hidey-hole under the board. He held it out. My hidey-hole at home has my best rock in it. This one had this. Elowen took the packet from him. It was oilcloth, like the ledger's wrapping, tied with the same gray tape, and it was thin. When she weighed it in her hand, she felt the particular give. A folded paper. She did not open it in front of the boy. She thanked him with all the gravity the discovery deserved, told him it was a fine piece of finding, sent him off to report the hidey-hole to his mother, and when he had gone, she sat down on the tailgate, with the packet in her lap, and her heart going hard, because she knew, without knowing how she knew, that this was the thing the second wagon had been keeping for her all along. The reason the knot had been her husband's. The reason the letters cut into the sideboard had been his to cut. She untied the tape. Inside were letters, and they were in her husband's hand. She knew his hand the way she knew his knot. She had watched it write out feed accounts and mark the lease. And once a year, on the day set down her mother's name on a scrap he kept in his Bible. Here was that same hand. Younger, the letters standing straighter, less worn, but unmistakably his. The topmost letter was not addressed to anyone. It began without greeting, the way a person writes, when the words will not stay inside any longer, and there is no one left to hear them. Elowen read the first line, and the meadow went away from her, the steaming grass, and the boy's distant voice, and the sun on her shoulders. All of it gone, and there was only her husband's young hand on the page, telling her, at last, in his own words, the thing he had carried down this mountain, and never once been able to speak. The letter was undated. It began without her name, without any name, because it had not been meant for anyone. It had been meant only to hold a man together on a night, when nothing else would. I rode down. That was the first line. I rode down and they turned me away. Elowen read the second line, and set the letter flat on her knee, because her hands were shaking too hard to hold it. She read it again, slowly. I rode down and they turned me away. The clerk at the land office would not look at my papers. He said the claim did not exist in his book. He said a boy of 2 and 20 on a foundered horse was no witness. He said the mountain played tricks on green riders, and I should go sleep it off. I did not sleep. I begged at 3 doors that night. I begged for a wagon. I begged for a doctor. I begged for 2 men and a mule. Nobody came. Nobody but a preacher's wife who gave me bread and said she would pray. And prayer, God forgive me, was not what I had ridden down to fetch. Elowen pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth. I rode back up with what little help I could beg on my own, which was nothing, which was myself. I rode until the mare went lame at the second creek. And then I walked, and by the time I reached the meadow the second time, the wagons stood where I had left them. And no living soul stood among them. I called until my throat broke. I searched every wagon, every quilt still folded, every pot still hanging. And I understood then what a fool I had been to leave. I understood that if I had stayed, if I had waited one more day, if I had trusted the good water, and the mending children, and my own 2 hands to keep them safe, until the pass opened, but I did not stay. I rode down. and I came back to a silence 18 people wide. I do not know where they went. I do not know if they walked into the timber to look for me and lost the trail. I do not know if they tried the pass and the snow took them. I do not know. That is the worst of it. Not the losing, the not knowing. I will carry this the rest of my life. I will not marry. I will not father children. I will not build. Because a man who has cost 18 souls their lives has forfeited the right to make new ones. That much is plain. The next letter was dated 3 years later. Then 5. Then 7. Then, in the 8th year, the year Elowen knew because she had counted it forward, from his arrival in Hollowbrook, a letter dated the 3rd of September. Elowen. Her breath stopped, because for the first time in the whole thin bundle, he had used her name. Elowen. I was not going to write to you, because writing to you means giving you a piece of the man I have not been able to give you standing at the kitchen sink. But I have been sitting by the river all night, and the water will not let me lie any longer. So I write, and you may find this, or you may not. I cannot decide which I hope. You asked me tonight when I came in from the barn whether we should try again. And I said yes, and I meant it, because I love you enough to want to give you the thing you ask for. But I also knew, as I said it, that we would not have a child. We have never been going to have a child. And it is not your fault, Elowen. My love, my whole heart, it is not your fault. It has never been your fault. There is a room inside me that has been locked for 25 years. And no child was ever going to be born on the other side of that door. Not because you were not enough. Not because your body was not enough. But because I have never once, in all our years together, brought my whole self into our bed. I have only brought the part of me that came down off a mountain in 1861. And the part of me that stayed up there has been the part that would have made a father. You deserve the whole man. You have never had the whole man. And I do not know how to give him to you now. But I want you to know, if you ever read this, that the emptiness in our house has never once been you. It has always been me, and the room I could not open, and the door I could not walk through. Forgive me, or do not. Only, please, my dear, do not carry this as your own. It was never yours to carry. Silas. Elowen sat very still on the tailgate. The sun was warm on the back of her neck. Somewhere, Toby was laughing at something the mare had done. Somewhere, Ezekiel was calling to clemency in the low, glad voice a man uses when the worst is behind him. The meadow went on being the meadow. And Elowen Whitmore, 36 years old, 3 months a widow, sat on a wagon that had held her husband's grief for a quarter century, and read, in his own hand, the sentence she had waited 8 years for someone in the world to say. It was never yours to carry. She did not sob. She had done her sobbing already. She only put her forehead down on the folded letter, and breathed, and breathed, and breathed, until the shape of her chest remembered how to hold a breath without shattering. Silas, Silas, you fool. Silas, my Silas, you stupid, gentle, beautiful fool. You wrote it down. You wrote it down, and hid it in a wagon on a mountain instead of saying it in our kitchen. She almost laughed, because if she did not laugh, she was going to break. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She folded the letters back into their oilcloth. She tied the tape. She slid the packet into the pocket of his coat, against her ribs, where it belonged. And then she stood up, because there was still a family to get down off this mountain, and a claim to file, and a man in a fawn-colored waistcoat to answer for what he had done. They came down off the ridge on the 4th morning, the mare leaning into the travois harness with a patience that seemed to understand the worth of what she pulled. Elowen walked at her head the whole length of that trail, one hand on the cheek piece, choosing every step for the horse the way the horse had once chosen every step for her. Clemency rode the drag, bedded in quilts, her splinted leg braced straight, Toby tucked in the crook of her arm. Ezekiel walked behind, a hand ready on the frame at every switchback. His blistered palms wrapped in strips of the shirt Elowen had torn for his wife's leg. The shale slope in daylight was worse than it had been in the dark. Elowen was glad the night had spared them all a clear look at it, while they were on it. She unhitched the travois at the top, led the mare across alone, one careful step at a time, went back for the drag, hauled it across empty, rehitched below. The whole crossing cost the better part of an hour. Toby she carried herself, the boy's arms locked trusting around her neck. She set him down on the solid trail beyond, told him he had crossed a dragon's back and lived. He considered this with great seriousness, and decided it was true. They came into Hollowbrook in the middle of the afternoon. The town saw them before they reached the first buildings, because a woman leading a laden mare down the wagon track, with a travois behind, and a family aboard it, is a thing that draws eyes, and the eyes came out onto porches, and into doorways, and stood in the dust of the street to watch them pass. The drover who had snorted into his coffee was there. The woman with flour on her sleeve came out onto the boardwalk drying her hand, and Elowen, walking at the mare's head, with her torn shirt and her mud-caked boots, and her husband's box riding behind the saddle, did not look at any of them, because she was looking for one face, and she found it, where she had known she would, on the porch of the Cornerstone Hotel, standing in the doorway, with a coffee cup arrested halfway to his mouth. Cornelius Draker watched her come. The smooth certainty that had sat on his broad face across the long table 2 weeks before was not there now. Something else had come into it, something that moved behind his eyes and was gone before it could be named. A quick, cold calculation. The look of a man who has seen a card he was sure had been burned turn up in another player's hand. He set the cup down on the porch rail without seeming to notice he had done it. "You'll want the doctor." Elowen pitched it to the street at large. Not to him, and her voice carried the way a voice carries when it has stopped being afraid of the people it is aimed at. "This woman's leg is broke below the knee. She's carried her boy through a hard night on Silver Peak. She'll want tending, and so will the child." She stopped the mare before the doctor's porch, 3 doors down from the Cornerstone, and she did not so much as glance at Draker as she passed him, which was its own kind of blow, and she felt it land. Dr. Pruitt came out, a spare gray man, took one look at the splint and the travois. His eyebrows went up. "Who set this leg?" "I did." Elowen was already unlashing the travois. "My husband set bone. I held the lamp enough years to learn the trick of it." Pruitt crouched by Clemency, ran his hands down the splint, tested the binding, grunted. The grunt was approval. "It'll do." He looked up at her with a new attention. "It'll more than do. I've seen worse from men who charge for it." He straightened. "You brought them down off the Ridge Road." "I did." "Nobody comes down off the Ridge Road." He said it the way the freighter had said the mountain keeps what it takes, as a thing everyone knew, a law of the country, and Elowen felt the whole watching street lean in to hear how she would answer it. And she gave them the answer plain, because she wanted it heard. People have been coming down off that ridge for 25 years. The trouble is that somebody made sure they were never believed when they did. It went through the crowd like a stone, through still water. That sentence spreading out in rings of murmur. And up on the Cornerstone porch, Cornelius Draker's hand closed slowly around the rail. She saw it. She was meant to see it. She turned from the doctor's porch, walked back up the street, toward the hotel, toward the man. The crowd that had gathered to watch a rescue found itself, without quite understanding how, watching something else. The street went quiet the way a room goes quiet when 2 people who mean each other harm walk toward the same small space. "Mr. Draker." She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him. "You told the county, over supper, that the mountain would keep me. You seemed very sure of it." Draker recovered himself the way a practiced man does, the smoothness sliding back down over whatever had cracked. He came to the top of the steps. "I'm glad to be proven wrong. A young woman surviving a foolish errand is a happy thing. You've a family alive because of it, I hear." He spread his hands. "Magnanimous. Though I'd think a week in that country would teach a person there's nothing up there but rotten ghost stories." And no cause for a sensible town to go stirring either. There's a good deal up there. She did not raise her voice. 6 wagons still standing. 18 names still legible. And a land claim filed, and witnessed in the spring of '61 for the whole of the high meadow water. She watched the word claim go into him like a splinter under a nail, watched the small muscle jump at the corner of his jaw before he could still it. You'd know something about a claim on that meadow, I think. A man in your line would. I know, Draker said carefully. The smoothness had gone thin over the top of him now, stretched. That a great many wild claims were filed in the territory in those years. By people who never proved them up and never came back. The law has a word for such ground. Abandoned. It reverts. It becomes available to men willing to do something with it. He had recovered his footing. She could hear it. Whatever moldering paper you found in a rotted wagon, Mrs., hasn't the weight of a dry leaf. 25 years unproven. No heir ever come forward. No complaint ever filed. That's not a claim. That's a scrap. He steadied. And a scrap doesn't stop a railroad survey. There it was. He had said it himself. In front of the street. The word he had not meant to say. And Elowen let it hang there a moment, so that the town could hear it settle. A railroad survey. She repeated it gently, as though tasting it. Now that's a thing I hadn't mentioned, Mr. Draker. I said a claim. And a meadow. You said a railroad. She lifted her chin. A man only reaches for the reason a thing matters to him. When he's forgotten, for half a breath, that the person across from him doesn't know it yet. The muscle in his jaw jumped again. This time he could not hide it. Up and down the boardwalk, the townspeople who had come out to watch a rescued family go into the doctors were looking now at the man on the hotel porch. And the looks had changed. Josiah Penn came out of the crowd. He had been standing at its edge. Elowen realized, since before she reached the doctors, the old wheelwright with his darkened knuckles. He came now to stand at the foot of the porch steps beside her, not speaking, only placing himself there. One more body between Draker and the easy retreat into the hotel. I knew a clerk once, Josiah said. To the air, in the mild tone of a man remembering something, over a fence rail. Land office clerk, over in the territorial seat, back before it was a seat, when it was 2 streets and a courthouse tent. Ambitious fellow. Pulled a filing now and again, so I heard, when the ground was good and the filer was far off. Nobody could ever prove it, on account of the record being the only proof. And the record being exactly what a clerk's best place to lose. He turned his gray eyes up to Draker, unhurried, without heat, which made it worse. Fellow moved on after a few years. Came into money. Changed the way a man does when the money comes in. But the face doesn't change so much, Cornelius. Not to a man who's been looking at faces across a workbench for 40 years. The silence that came down over the street then was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of a great many people rearranging all at once a story they had believed for a quarter of a century. Draker's face had gone a bad color. That is a slander. He said it low. The smoothness was gone entirely. A filthy slander from a broken-down old man, who's jealous of every dollar he never earned. I'll not stand on my own porch and, then don't stand on it. Elowen did not let him finish. Come down to the land office with me now, in front of these people. We'll lay my papers on the counter, and let the clerk read them. And if they're the dry leaf you say, you've nothing to fear, and I'll have made a fool of myself in front of the whole town. And you can laugh me back up the mountain. But if they're what I say they are. She looked up at him. Then a great many people who trusted your word about that road, including a mother, whose leg is being splinted 3 doors down, because a man in the low country swore to her husband the ridge was sound, will want to know how you came by your certainty. That it was empty ground. He did not come down to the land office. That, in the end, was the thing the town remembered. A guilty man given the chance to prove himself innocent in the open street, and refusing it. says more than any paper. He stood on his porch and told them it was beneath him, that he'd answer a slander in a court of law, and not in a dusty street to a mob stirred up by a jealous cripple and a widow. He went inside. The door of the Cornerstone Hotel shut behind him, and the town stood in the street and looked at the shut door. And the shut door answered every question the open one would not. Elowen went to the land office that same afternoon, before her nerve or the town's attention could cool. Josiah penned beside her, the dovetailed box and the tin box under her arm. She laid the papers on the counter, before the clerk, who kept the Hollowbrook office. Wendell Bright, 28 years old, slight, serious, with ink on his cuffs, and a careful way of handling old paper. That told Elowen, before he had read 3 lines, that this was not a man cut from Draker's cloth. Wendell read the claim twice. He read the filing receipt. He held the survey lines up to the window light, traced them with a clean fingernail. Then he set it all down very gently, as though it might come apart under a rough touch. Looked at Elowen with something in his face that was almost awe. This receipt carries a filing number. His voice was not quite steady. Every filing number is entered in the territorial register, in sequence, the day it's made. If this receipt is genuine, there's a number in the master register at the territorial seat that either matches it or does not. If it matches, this claim was filed. Whatever became of it after, if the register shows that number blank, or assigned to other ground, or torn clean out, then someone reached into the register after the fact. Josiah finished it, and made a filed claim into a scrap. Wendell nodded slowly. I can send to the seat for a certified copy of the register page. It'll take the better part of 2 weeks. There and back by the mail rider. He squared the papers with both hands. But I'll tell you plain, Mrs. In 11 years keeping records, I have never once seen a forgery of a filing receipt. They're not worth forging. A receipt's only good if the register backs it. So a forger gains nothing, which means either this is the strangest useless forgery ever made, or it is exactly what it appears to be. And somebody has spent 25 years praying no one would ever come down off that ridge to make me send this letter. He looked her in the eye. I'll send it tomorrow, with my own hand, to the recorder himself, not to any clerk beneath him. They sealed the boxes that afternoon, in front of Wendell, and Dr. Pruitt, and Josiah, under wax, under 2 keys, in the office strongbox, where no smooth voice could reach them. The trouble came the next morning, came wearing the face of the law, which is how such trouble comes. A deputy marshal rode in, from the territorial seat before noon. Lean man, unhurried, star on his coat, folded paper in his saddlebag. He asked in the street for the Whitmore woman. He found her at the livery. The paper was a charge of theft, alleging that Elowen Whitmore had removed valuable property, historical documents and effects, from land belonging to the Hollowbrook Land and Cattle Company, of which Cornelius Draker was the principal, demanding return of all such property, and her appearance before the territorial court to answer for the taking. Elowen read the paper standing in the livery yard. The cleverness of it turned her cold. Draker could not attack the papers, so he had moved to take them back. Dressed as the law, before Wendell's letter could go to the seat. The land belongs to the Hollowbrook Land and Cattle Company, she said. Level. That's what the paper says. That's what it says. The deputy did not seem to enjoy his errand, but he did not seem inclined to shirk it either. Company claims the ridge meadow. Company says you took goods off it. I'm to collect the goods and see you bound over. That's the whole of my instruction, Mrs. I don't write them, I just ride them. And if the company doesn't own the meadow, if the company only means to own it, and the goods you've been sent to collect are the exact papers that prove the company never owned so much as a rock of it. She held the folded charge back out to him. You'd be carrying stolen evidence back to the man who wants it burned, deputy, and you'd be doing it with a star on your coat. The deputy's face did not change, but something behind it did. "There's a clerk at the land office here, Wendell Bright, sending to the territorial seat for a certified copy of a register page. 2 weeks there and back. That page will show whether the meadow was ever filed unlawfully." She let that set. "All I ask is that you don't carry these papers out of this town for 2 weeks. Hold them, seal them, lock the box in the land office under Wendell's key and the county's, where neither Draker nor I can touch them. Let the register page decide who the thief is." She met his eyes. "If I'm lying, you'll have lost nothing but a little time." The deputy sat his horse a long moment, turning the folded charge over in his gloved hands. Then he did the thing that Elowen would afterward believe was the true turning of the whole affair. He folded the paper once more, put it away in his coat unserved. "I'll not collect goods that are in dispute, when there's a lawful way to settle the dispute standing right there in the land office. The box goes under seal, under 2 keys, and nobody opens it till the register page comes back." His eyes rested on her, level, unsentimental. "If your papers are what you say, the man who swore this charge has got a great deal more to answer for than you do. And if they're not, I'll be back for you myself." The next 2 weeks were the longest of Elowen's life. Draker did not spend them idle. He could not reach the box, so he reached for her, in the ways a man of his standing reaches, which are quieter than a marshal's star. Word went around that the Whitmore widow's story didn't hold, that the papers were a fever dream, that a person who'd steal from a company was a person who'd lie to a town. The liveryman who'd let her sleep in his loft for free grew suddenly cool. Mentioned that the loft was needed. A merchant who'd extended her a little credit called it in. Small blows. Separately she could have borne any of them. Together they were the sound of a man, with money teaching a town what it cost to take a poor widow's side against him. Ambrose came to see her on the 5th night. He caught her at the pump behind the livery, alone, which he had planned. He was wearing his good coat. His voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that was practiced. "Elowen, I'll give you back a share of the house, half of what it's worth. Cash. Tomorrow. You take the mare and the money and you go. Any town but this one. And you never say the name Whitmore again. And you never say the name Draker either." She looked at him. "He sent you. I came on my own." "He sent you." Ambrose did not answer, which was answer enough. "Get off this yard, Ambrose." "Elowen, think. You're one widow against." "I said get off this yard." He went. She stood by the pump a long time after he was gone, with her hand flat against the cold iron of the handle, and her breathing steadier than she would have believed it could be. On the 8th night, someone came to the livery in the dark. She woke to Juniper's scream. She was down the ladder before she thought to grab a lamp. The mare stood in her stall shivering. A long cut opened across her withers. Not deep enough to kill, deep enough to say what it meant to say. Elowen sank down in the straw. She put her arms around the mare's neck. And she cried, for the first time since the fever, since Silas, since anything. She cried into the warm bay hide of the horse her husband had loved. And she said, over and over, into Juniper's ear, "I'm sorry, Junie. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." And then she got up, and she cleaned the wound with hot water and lye soap, and she stitched it herself. 9 stitches, by lamplight, with the mare standing patient and trembling. And when she was done, she was not a woman who was going to run. She was a woman who was going to see this through. Adelaide came on the 11th day. She came to the livery, which she had never once entered in her life. She stood in the doorway, with her handbag clutched in both hands, in front of her chest, like a shield. "Elowen." Elowen looked up from her bucket. "Elowen, drop this. I am begging you, as one woman to another. Drop it. This is not a fight for a widow to be in. There are things men do that women should not touch. If you drop it, I will speak to Ambrose. He will give you a room in the back of the house, until you find your feet." "Mother-in-law." Elowen straightened. Set the bucket down. Mother-in-law, you stood up in a church 3 months ago, and you told every soul who knew me that I killed your son, with the emptiness of my body. Adelaide's face did not change, because Adelaide's face never changed. That was grief speaking. That was you speaking, and I sat through it, and I walked out, and I have not asked you for one thing since. And I am not asking now. I am telling. The place Silas told me to be, on the last morning of his life, is where I am standing, and it isn't behind Ambrose, and it isn't behind you, and it isn't behind any man in this town. It's here, on my own 2 feet, with his mare in the stall behind me, and his name on the papers that are going to break the man who broke him. She looked at Adelaide a long moment. You may go now. And Adelaide went. Clemency Ashcroft, chair by the mercantile window, with her leg propped, and her boy at her knee, held court all those 2 weeks, told her story the same way every time, plain, unhurried, the way a true thing gets told. A man in the low country swore to my husband the ridge road was sound. A stranger rode a mile of black shale in a storm to carry me up out of the weather, and asked for nothing. She named the stranger. She named, when pressed, the look of the man who had sent them, broad, well-dressed in the low country, and she let the town draw the line between that description and the man on the cornerstone porch. I don't say who it was. I only say what he did, and what he said, and what it near cost my family. A person can put the name to it themselves. Most folks can, once they've a mind to look. And her hand would rest, as it always did, when she spoke of that night, on the head of the boy at her feet, bright, unbothered, entirely himself, the plainest evidence in the world that a mother's steadiness and a stranger's courage had held the danger off. The town, looking at that living child, found the smooth man's version harder and harder to swallow. The certified copy of the register page came back on the 13th day. The mail rider brought it into the land office a little after noon. A heavy envelope, sealed with the territorial recorder's stamp. Wendell would not open it alone. He sent the livery boy running. For the deputy, who had stayed the 2 weeks in Hollowbrook rather than ride back and forth. For Josiah, for the county recorder, for Elowen. Word of what the envelope was ran through the town faster than any boy could run, so that by the time Elowen reached the land office, the street outside was filling, and among the faces filling it, she saw coming down from the cornerstone with 2 men at his back, Cornelius Draker himself, because a man who has staked everything on a page cannot stay away when the page is being opened. They opened it inside at the counter, with the door standing open so the front rank of the street could see. Wendell broke the recorder's seal, with hands that were not steady, drew out the certified page, laid it flat on the counter, smoothed it. For a moment no one breathed. Then his finger found the line. His face told it before his voice could. The filing number on Elowen's receipt matched a line in the master register. But the line in the register did not carry the claim of the 2 families of the wagon train. It had been altered. The original entry, still faintly legible beneath, showed the meadow filed to the names in the ledger. In the spring of 1861, over it, in a different ink, and a different hand, someone had written a note of abandonment and reversion, dated 3 years later, and beneath that, the reassignment of the ground to a new filer's name, entered in that second careless triumphant hand, a quarter-century ago, was a name the whole street knew, Cornelius Draker. He didn't tear it out, Wendell almost to himself, looking down at the doctored page. He was too clever to tear it out. A torn page shows. He wrote over it. He let the number stand, and changed what the number meant. 25 years. And it was here the whole time. For anyone who knew to send for it. He looked up. His young face had gone hard. Which is why the receipt had to disappear. Which is why a company swore a theft charge to get it back. The street had heard enough of it through the open door. It moved through the crowd the way the first stone had moved, through it days before. but heavier now, final. The faces that had wavered under Draker's money stopped wavering, and turned, all of them, slow and unanimous, toward the broad, well-dressed man standing frozen at the edge of his own undoing. Draker did not run. Men like him do not run until the very end, and sometimes not even then. He drew himself up, reached for the smoothness one last time, found it gone, spent on the porch 2 weeks before. What came out of him instead was something no one had heard before. He laughed, a small dry laugh, from the back of his throat. You think a page of ink stops me? He shook his head, almost pitying. You think one clerk in one office, and one deputy from the seat, and one widow with a dead husband's mare, stops me? I have a judge in the seat, who owes me his last 3 elections. I have a railroad survey team camped this side of the pass, waiting on my telegram. His hand went inside his coat, and came out with a small pistol, the kind of gun a well-dressed man carries close to his body, and rarely draws. He did not point it at Elowen. He pointed it at Wendell Bright. Give me the page, son. The land office went very still. Wendell did not move. Elowen felt the whole street behind her stop breathing, and she thought later she would think that this was the moment her whole life had been walking toward, because she stepped forward, between Draker's pistol and Wendell's chest. Slow, deliberate. She did not raise her hands. She only put herself in the line. Mr. Draker. Her voice was level. You want that page. You go through me first. His pistol did not move, but his eyes did. They flickered, once, and in that flicker she saw a thing she had not expected to see. She saw a man who had built his whole life on the assumption that a widow with no child was a woman who could not be believed, and could not be feared, and could not, above all, put her body in the road of his. She had violated a rule he had lived by since he was a 2-street clerk in a courthouse tent, and it undid him. Josiah Penn stepped up beside her, old hands empty at his sides. And me too, Cornelius. Ezekiel Ashcroft came out of the crowd, positioned himself on her other side. And me. Clemency, on her crutch, hobbled forward from where she had been standing at the mercantile door, and planted her good foot beside Elowen's, and said nothing, because the good foot was enough. Dr. Pruitt, the livery boy, the woman with flour on her sleeve, 3 men from the sawmill, one after another, slow, awkward, the way a town moves when it has been wrong for too long and has just remembered how to be right. And then, at the back, Elowen would not see her until later, would only be told, and would not quite believe it. Adelaide Whitmore stepped out of the doorway of the mercantile, where she had been standing, and walked to the front of the crowd, and stood there, not beside Elowen, that would have been too much to ask, but at the front, facing Draker, which was, in its way, enough. The pistol wavered. Draker looked around the street, saw the town he had owned for 25 years standing between him and 1 page of ink, and he understood, all at once, what he had lost. He lowered the pistol. The deputy took it from his hand, as gently as a man takes a broken thing from a child. They led him out of the land office, through the crowd that had parted for him 100 times over the years. And that did not part for him now. Elowen stood at the counter, with Wendell's shoulder still warm against her back, where he had not moved, and where he had, she understood, been prepared to die. She did not go to the Cornerstone that night. She did not stay at the livery either. She walked, in the last blue light, to a low turf and timber house behind the churchyard, and she knocked on the door. Mercy Halloway opened it before her hand fell, as though the old woman had been standing behind it for a long time, waiting. Come in, child. The inside was small, and clean and smelled of dried herbs, and would smoke. Mercy lowered herself into a chair by the hearth, gestured Elowen to the other. For a while she only looked at her, at the shape of the eyes and the set of the mouth, as if 2 faces were sitting there at once, Elowen's own, and another face she had not seen in 25 years. You have the look of him, about the eyes. Elowen went still. I was on that train. Mercy's pale eyes went far off. Not a child. I was 25, newly married. My husband and I were joined with the Alderman family and the Whitcomb family, bound west together. I kept the ledger. That was my hand you followed all the way to the last page. She paused. Yes, I have wondered all these years who would read it, and whether they would understand what it was trying to say. You did. You understood the open arc. Not many would have. The children, Elowen said, her voice barely a voice, said they were mending. They were. Something eased in the old woman. Some long-held tension going out of her at last. Every child on that train came down off the mountain, Elowen. Every one. Your husband did not fail us. That is the thing he died not knowing. And it is the thing I have waited a quarter of a century to put into the hand of someone who could carry it to him. She leaned forward. Her voice, though low, had the force of a thing said once and meant forever. He rode down for help and was turned away by a wicked man. We could not know that. We only knew the snow was coming, and the little ones were on the mend, and we dared not wait longer. So we did the hard thing. We carried them out ourselves, down the deer trail, in the one clear spell the weather gave us. Took us 4 days. It near broke the groan among us. But we came down into the low country far to the south, into a settlement that had never heard of Hollowbrook. And there we were taken in. You never came back. We could not. By the time we were strong enough to think of it, we had learned, through a freighter, the way you learn everything in this country, that a young outrider had come down half-dead swearing we were lost, and been called a liar, and that the ground we had filed on had already been declared abandoned, and taken up by a clerk who had risen fast and would rise fast. She folded her hands in her lap. We understood then what had been done, and to whom, and by whom. We were poor and scattered and frightened. I will not pretend to you it was courage that kept us away. It was fear. We had our children. We had come through with our children, and we would not risk them again against a powerful man for the sake of a mountain meadow we could live without. She met Elowen's eyes without flinching. So the families settled where they had fallen, took new names against the day the clerk might come looking, and raised their little ones, and let the meadow keep itself. We chose our children over our claim. I have never once been sorry for that choice. She paused. But I have carried all my life the knowing of what it cost your husband. Elowen sat very still by the fire. Then why come here? Of all the towns, why Hollowbrook, at the foot of the very mountain? Because someone had to keep the door open. Mercy said it simply. The others scattered south and made their peace with forgetting. I could not forget. I came back an old woman by then. No threat to anyone. Just the quiet crone behind the churchyard. And I settled, where I could watch the ridge road. And I waited. She rose, slower than she had sat, went to a small chest against the wall, lifted from it a bundle of letters tied, with faded ribbon. Put them into Elowen's hands. They were addressed, all of them in Mercy's own hand, to names Elowen did not know, in settlements scattered across 3 territories. And they had never been sent. The heirs, the children of that train, grown now, with children of their own, scattered across 3 territories under names they took to hide. I know where every one of them is. I have written to them all these years, and never dared to send a word, for fear of drawing the smooth man's eye. Her thin hand closed over Elowen's. But the smooth man is going to a territorial court now, child. And the meadow is yours to give back. And there is no longer any reason on this earth for those families to stay lost. Elowen looked down at the letters, at a quarter century of a woman writing, into a silence she had been too frightened to break. Then you will do the one thing left that can answer him. Mercy laid her hand along Elowen's cheek. Her river ice eyes were wet at last. You will bring them home where he could not. And every family that stands in that meadow again will be your husband riding back up the trail at last, arriving finally, after 25 years, to find that no one was lost. Elowen rode up to the meadow one last time, before the autumn closed the trail. Alone, on Juniper, in the gold of a late September afternoon. On the first September 3rd he was not there to keep. She carried the dovetailed box behind the saddle. The claim proven now. Recorded. Safe. She carried the first letter she had sent to a woman of 40 in a southern settlement, who had been the infant of 4 months on the roster. And her answer, in which the woman had wept, she said, to learn that the mountain her mother spoke of in her last years was real, and that she might see it before she died. The meadow received her the way it had the first time, with its long-kept stillness. But the stillness had changed, or Elowen had. The wagons stood as she had left them, canvases mended, tongues blocked and drying, but they no longer looked abandoned, and they no longer looked asleep. They looked like what they were, place made ready, a home kept against the return of the people who belonged to it. She walked the arc in the slant of the light, stood a while in the open eastern gap her husband had left, looking down the trail he had ridden, thinking of him at 22, thinking of the girl of 25 who had grown into the woman behind the churchyard, thinking of all the years the two of them had kept faith across, one on the mountain and one in the town, never knowing the other kept it too. She set the mended wooden horse on the driver's seat of the first wagon, in the light where the first grandchild to make the climb would see it, and she went at last to the second wagon, the one where Silas had cut his letters into the sideboard. She climbed inside, sat down cross-legged on the old dry planks, where he had once sat. At 22, frightened and full of a promise he could not keep, she took out the last of the letters from his packet, the one on the 3rd of September, the one where he had used her name. She read it once, to herself, in her head, then she read it again, out loud, in the small holy space of the wagon, so that whatever piece of him was still up here in the meadow could hear it. She read, "It has never been your fault. There is a room inside me that has been locked for 25 years. She read, "Forgive me, or do not. Only please, my dear, do not carry this as your own." She read to the end. Then she folded the letter, and she said, out loud to the wagon, and to the meadow and to the man, "Silas, I have found them." Every child came down. Mercy carried them out on foot. Every child. Do you hear me? Every child. The meadow held its silence. "I forgive you." Her voice broke, steadied. "I forgive you for the room you couldn't open, and I forgive you for the door you couldn't walk through, and I forgive you for 8 years of a marriage, where I only had part of you, because part of you loving me all the way through was more than most women get from a whole man." She wiped her face with the sleeve of his coat. "And I forgive myself, Silas. That's the hard part. I forgive myself for believing them, for believing I was empty, for believing you married me for a womb I couldn't fill. I know now what I never knew, that I was enough, that I was always enough. You told me and I didn't believe you, but I believe you now." She pressed her palm against the carved letters.
S. W 1861.
Where 15 years before her name, he had cut his initials into the wood. "And I am not a black widow, Silas. I am not a woman who killed her husband. I am the keeper of the door, and I will spend the rest of my life bringing them home, one family at a time, until this meadow is full of the sound of children again."